Right, so hello everyone, and on behalf of the Education and Engagement team at the UK Parliament, thank you so much for joining us for our first ever online Learn with the Lords question time. So my name's Rebecca. I'm going to be hosting today's event, which is part of our annual UK Parliament Week Festival. I can see already that we're joined by over 30 schools from all across the United Kingdom, which is absolutely amazing. So thank you all so much for joining us. So today's event is in two parts. We're going to be starting with a panel discussion, during which our panel will be discussing how effective the UK Parliament is, and particularly the House of Lords, at scrutinising the government. This discussion will reflect on the relationship between Parliament and government, how this can change and evolve over time, and what that means for effective scrutiny. After this, I'm going to be putting your questions to our panel of experts, so make sure you listen out for your school's name. So on today's panel, we are thrilled to be joined by 5 members of the House of Lords, who hopefully you can all see clearly on your screen. We are joined by Baroness Garden of Frognall. We are joined also by Lord Lisvane, Baroness Massey of Darwin, Lord Young of Cookham, and Baroness Lane Fox. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Lord Young to make the first point in the panel discussion element, and we will go from there. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Rebecca, and I hope that some of those watching will consider a career in politics and in a few years' time maybe answering the questions instead of asking them. On the first point, how the House of Lords holds the government to account, I'll just make 3 very quick points. First, the government has no majority in the House of Lords, where it has a majority in the House of Commons, and so it tends to have to win the argument in the House of Lords, whereas in the Commons, usually, and I say this as a former Chief Whip, they can rely on the government's majority. Second, in the House of Lords, and then when it comes to legislation, we can spend more time going through the details and make suggestions to improve it. And then the third and final point is every now and then we do use our teeth. When I first got here, we overturned, very unusually, a statutory instrument that had been approved by the House of Commons on universal credit. And that made the government think again, and actually they reversed the policy. So I think those are 3 areas where the House of Lords really can make a difference.
Thank you so much, Lord Young. That was a great start. I can see we've got some hands up, so I'll go next to Baroness Garden.
Well, thank you very much. I would much rather be talking to you in person. I always enjoy going into schools and doing battle with the very good questions that we get asked there. Yes, I mean, Lord Young set the scene very ably, of course. We do scrutinise. I mean, our job in the House of Lords is to scrutinise. And of course, we do have much more times than the Commons does, because they've all got constituents to look after and things like that, whereas we don't. But I think the effectiveness is shown by the times that the government is defeated in the House of Lords. And of course, it always has to go back to the Commons because they're democratically elected, whereas we're absolutely unforgivably appointed at the whim of the Prime Minister. But very often the governments will realise that the expertise that we have in the Lords means that the amendments we've made make a lot of sense. And so they do accept those. So, but I just would finally add that scrutiny is much more difficult now that we've got so few peers actually present in the chamber. Most people are looming at us through Zoom screens. You cannot hold ministers to account in the same way if they're looming rather than if they're actually eyeballing them. Thank you.
That's a really interesting point. Maybe we'll come back to the impact of COVID on scrutiny a little bit later. We'll move on next to Baroness Massey.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, my two previous colleagues who've made a number of very excellent points. I want to make 2 quick points. Apart from going over and combing through bills and making the Commons hopefully think again often, we also scrutinise by our questions. We have question time every day and we ask ministers questions. Sometimes they're very direct, and well, they are always direct and puts the minister on the spot a bit, but that's part of what Parliament's about, debate and agreement or non-agreement. And we also have a very excellent committee system. We have committees. I'm on the Joint Committee of Human Rights, which is Commons and Lords together. and we scrutinise bills in that way or other issues in that way and produce what I think are superb reports. And if you want to get hold of any, I know that you could, and they are extremely well thought through and well delivered. So those 2 points I want to make.
Oh, thank you very much, Baroness Massey. We'll move on now to Lord Lisvane.
I agree with what my colleagues have been saying, but I'd make a distinction, I think, between what is, in effect, policy audit and policy scrutiny in select committees. And I speak as a former clerk of the House of Commons, and one of the good things about our committee system is that it doesn't clash with the House of Commons. It is, as it were, a horizontal system looking across issues rather than a vertical system looking at individual departments and their agencies and so on. But I'd make a distinction between what select committees are doing, which is hugely valuable, and legislative scrutiny. And I think legislative scrutiny, going to over-egg the pudding here, but it's a bit of a disaster area, because the difference between what is done in primary legislation, where you have major issues of policy and principle, and what is now increasingly done in secondary legislation, where you have a lower level of parliamentary scrutiny and public exposure, I think that is moving in the wrong direction. I think that might be a theme we come back to later on.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I do hope we do return to that, because I think that would be really interesting for the students that are watching. We'll turn next to Baroness Lane Fox.
Thank you very much. As always in the Lords, we're all very polite and agree with each other and agree with the previous speakers, which I do wholeheartedly. But I would just add 2 points from a slightly different perspective, perhaps. First of all, I think often in the outside world, the House of Lords is pitted in some kind of combative relationship with the Commons and with the outside world. You know, the Lords is taking a stand against X, Y, or Z, and it's easy to forget that actually we have power, but not as much as people think. And I have been struck in my relatively short tenure in the Lords, actually, as always, it's about collaboration with colleagues in the House of Commons. And if I could give a specific example, a friend and colleague of mine in the crossbench group, Baroness Kidron, who's done a lot about children's online rights and protection of them in the world that I come from, which is technology. She's put some amendments into a big, huge piece of legislation, the GDPR legislation, which some people watching may be aware of. But of course, it was done collaboratively by working with colleagues in the House of Commons, working with ministers in the other places, we call it. And I was always struck about how much work went on behind the scenes. And that was just one small amendment in one bill. And I'm absolutely sure that my very eminent colleagues around this panel will have many, many examples. So I think that's an important thing to remember. As with most things, collaboration is the most effective way to get stuff done. And I think I personally don't like this kind of combative setup that sometimes the media portray the House of Lords as doing. And secondly, just to really emphasize what Baroness Massey had said, I am privileged enough to chair the Select Committee on COVID-19 that's recently been set up. We're looking at the long-term implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not scrutiny, as Lord Lisvane has just pointed out, it's different, but it does have, you do have an opportunity as a member of a select committee to directionally say to the government, we think this is wrong, this is right. And it's really an incredible way of using the voice of the House of Lords. So I think that for me, I've enjoyed, and I think that often those moments of scrutiny come out of committee work, exactly as Baroness Massey has said. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. I really like that message of collaboration. I think we can all learn from that. Lord Young, perhaps you'd like to come in next. I can see you've got your hand up.
Just to add a footnote to what my colleagues have said. I've been a minister in both houses, and it's actually more difficult being a minister in the House of Lords. In the House of Commons, when I was a minister looking after, say, housing, I would reckon to know more about my portfolio than people asking me a question, because MPs tend to be more generous. In the House of Lords, it was absolutely the opposite. Anybody asking me a question knew much more about the subject than I did, because in the Lords we have experts, and the experts tend to come in on their subject. So far as being accountable as a minister is concerned, I had to work much, much harder in the House of Lords than I had to do in the House of Commons.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. I think that's probably quite surprising to a lot of the young people that are listening. So perhaps Lord Lisvane, would you like to come in next on that point?
Well, thank you. I I just make 2 points. One on the nature of select committees. And one of the great things about select committees in both houses, but we're talking about Lords select committees now, is that they make the parliamentary process accessible to people outside. So much of what we do, it might be a debate on a bill or something like that, takes place within one a compartment, a parliamentary compartment, whereas select committees, basing their conclusions on what experts and people who are going to be affected by particular policies outside, they mean that the parliamentary process can be made accessible to people outside. And the second point I made, just picking up on this business of
I'm so sorry, Lord Lisvane. Can I just remind all students watching to turn your microphones and your cameras off? I think someone might have had an accidental microphone on. It's always happens in these things. Don't worry, just pop it off for me. Thank you. Sorry, Lord Lisvane, back to you.
Not a problem. I'd make a distinction between expertise and experience. Which is, if I can put in a little advertisement here, I don't know how many of the students looking at us today have a copy of How Parliament Works, but I remember making the point in that book that there is a difference between expertise and experience. Expertise takes a lot of keeping up to date, and not every member of the House of Lords is in a position to do that. We have a very distinguished surgeon colleague on the cross benches, and I hope he keeps his expertise up to date. It would be very dangerous if he didn't. But one of the things that I think is a huge strength of the House is experience, where people have seen things before and they can make judgments and draw conclusions from the experience that they have.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a great distinction, and also excellent plug there for anyone that has not read How Parliament Works. I think you should all go ahead and do that. I have, and it's very good. It was very useful for me when I started at Parliament. So I saw Baroness Lane Fox, you put your hand up during something that Lord Lisvane was saying, so perhaps you'd like to come in next. Oh, you're on mute, Baroness Lane Fox.
Sorry,
there we go.
I think people frequently wish I was more on mute, so apologies for that. I just wanted to kind of add to all comments about the opportunity still to improve. You know, I wouldn't like people watching to think that, well, I certainly, in my experience of members of the House, I think we all believe that there's still more improvement that we can make as a House and as a chamber in terms of using the tools of the modern age to be more effective and scrutinise more effectively. Well, I take Baroness Gardner's point about us being digital and it's hard doing the work in the same way. I also think that, you know, it is fundamentally an institution based on a lot of principles from another time. And in my opinion, it's extremely important that we continue to kind of iterate it, to lose technology language, to use some of the things that other organizations in the outside world are using in terms of modern technology in order to make our jobs even more effective. And, you know, ideas might be to involve more members of the public in scrutiny. It might be to make the process of legislation that bit more open. So there are lots of different ideas from different countries. So I personally think it's incredibly important that we as a chamber continue to make sure that we are really being as aware of the modern world as we can be and don't get stuck in that building in a kind of 1820s style institutional setup.
Thank you very much, Baroness Lane Fox. I think the next hand up was Baroness Garden, and then we'll come to Lord Young.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'm just echoing what Lord Young said. During the coalition, I'm a Liberal Democrat, and during the coalition government, I was a government whip and minister. Now, the whips in the Commons don't speak. They're business managers. The whips in the Lords typically cover 3 departments, in none of which they are based. And we have to stand up and answer questions and take debates in the same way as the full-time ministers. So actually, yes, being a minister in the Lords is I think, a lot more demanding in many ways than a minister in the Commons, because we don't have the departmental support, in a way, that they do in the Commons. And I do entirely echo what Martha has said about the need for us to move with modern technology. I think that is vitally important. So I don't bemoan the fact that we're now having to do Zoom and Teams and all the rest of it in the Lords. I just bemoan the fact that we don't have that immediacy. We have set speakers lists, so there aren't any interventions. Now, interventions are a tremendous way of challenging the government. We can't intervene anymore because they're all set lists. And I think that has made our job of scrutiny that much more difficult. But certainly the virtual voting, I think, has been a great success. The fact that people don't have to queue up at 11 o'clock at night to go through the voting lobbies, but can actually sit in their pajamas and vote. I think this has been a great success. Yeah. So that might be something we hang on to when we go back to relatively normal times.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that point about interventions is really interesting, because obviously that's a really important part of scrutiny. So perhaps Lord Young, would you like to come in next? Oh, there we go. I think you're on mute, Lord Young. We're easily done.
The terms of trade have shifted towards the government in exactly the way that Sue Garden has just said, in that the way to catch a minister on the hop is to intervene him when he's in the middle of his peroration and ask him a question to which the answer is not in his brief. And at the moment, you can't do that. It's much easier in the Commons, where interventions are far more frequent. In the House of Lords, you're not meant to intervene quite so often and to sort of correct something the minister has said. But that spontaneity can expose a weakness in an argument, particularly if it's asked more than once. You may be able to sort of flannel your way out of the first intervention, but after 2 or 3 times, it becomes absolutely clear that you don't know the answer. The government may not have an answer. So that spontaneity is helpful. There's one other thing I hope we hang on to. At the moment, at question time in the House of Lords, I don't know if any of your viewers have watched it. It is not clear who is going to ask the next question, and there's a bit of a sort of gamesmanship as to who's going to sit down and let somebody else ask the question. With a list, which we now have, you can actually frame the people who are going to ask questions in some order of people who might actually ask an interesting question, rather than the person who's nearest the microphone, happens to have got the loudest voice, and refuses to sit down before anybody else. So I think, no names, but my colleagues will know exactly who I am referring to. And I think that's another of the innovations we might just want to hang on to when life returns to normal.
Okay, that's really interesting. I could see Lord Lisvane doing some very vigorous nodding there, so perhaps he'd like to come in next.
Well, no, only to agree mightily with Lord Young. Just one thing hanging on from something that Martha Fox was saying earlier on, and this business of competing and complementary. There is a great tendency, I think, to say, oh, well, the Lords does this well, or the Commons does that well, and the other House not as well. And one of the key things, it seems to me, about the power of Parliament, as compared with the power of the executive, which, alas, has been growing over recent years, is for the two houses to operate in a complementary way, where they're doing similar things, but they're actually doing them in different ways. And I think that collective power is much greater when the houses are seen to be complementary and not competing.
Okay, that's really interesting. Baroness Massey, I could see you waving during something Lord Lisvane said. So
a quick point following that from Lord Lisvane. I think the issue of collectivity is really important. Of course, the House of Lords is not elected, as the Commons is elected. Therefore, we can't ultimately win the argument if we're voting on legislation. But as other people have pointed out, we do have lots of experience, lots of expertise in the Lords. And I've just been noting down what I remember. There's Martha Fox there on technology. We've got sport, we've got medicine, we've got the arts, we've got health, we've got law, we've got everything. And I think what also I speak mainly about children and young people's issues. I consult outside to the voluntary sector, for example. I think we're very good at doing that, taking that expertise as well as our own expertise and feeding it back into a bill, for example, often with briefings from the voluntary sector. And I think that really works very well. And we often work across parties and across houses on that through, for example, all party parliamentary groups.
So I think that comes back nicely to Baroness Lane Fox's point about collaboration. So maybe Baroness Lane Fox, would you like to go next?
Thank you. I just wanted to give another example of exactly that point. I'm one of the directors of an organisation called Peers for the Planet, which was constructed by some colleagues who thought that it would be important to organise the House, not in a partisan way at all. We have members from all over the House to talk more effectively about climate issues. Arguably the most important thing we should be all worrying about in the next decade. And I'm sure many of the people watching today want to hear that Parliament is thinking about these issues very deeply. So a very brilliant colleague, Bryony Worthington, and an ex-Lord Speaker, head of the House of Lords, Baroness Hayman, set up this group, which I'm lucky enough to be a director. And we've got about 100 members from across the House, simply to organise around the issues of climate and to make sure that it both appears effectively in legislation, but also that we talk in questions and debates, and as Baroness Massey had said, used outside organisations to use our voice to scrutinise the government about really keeping that razor-sharp focus on climate and environmental issues. So again, that's a slightly different way of organising, and I don't know if there are other groups that have done it around other issues, but I've certainly been so amazed about how we can get stuff done by coordinating members from all parties, all groups. It's not partisan. It's been really fantastic.
Oh, fantastic. So an organisation to look out for there, everyone watching, Peers for the Planet, look out for that. Shall we go next to Baroness Garden and then Lord Young?
Yes, just picking up on this theme of collaboration. And of course, it's absolutely outrageous that we're appointed at the whim of the Prime Minister and completely undemocratic. But it does have the advantage we don't... Sorry? Oh, the crossbenchers.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just saying some of us aren't quite in the same category.
No, thank you. That's a good intervention. So you can do interventions over online platforms.
But equally, the crossbenchers, you know, I mean, it's still the choice of the Prime Minister as much as anything who comes in on the crossbenchers, isn't it? But the vast majority.
I applied, just to be totally clear. I filled in an application form.
Absolutely, you applied. I know you did, Martha. Yes, and you're
clear. There is a route into the Lords, which is, in my opinion, how everybody should enter into the Lords.
Absolutely.
You need to have an interview of some kind. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm very sorry.
No, it's right. I totally agree with you. I think that is, you know, I mean, I think it's appalling. I was appointed because Gordon Brown woke up one morning and thought he'd appointed loads of Labour peers. So he'd let the Lib Dems have 2 and the Conservatives have 2. And I just happened to be in the right place for one of the 2 Lib Dem slots. But because we don't have to fight elections, we can actually collaborate much more across party. There's much more cross-party friendship within the Lords than there ever really could be in the Commons in quite the same way, because come the day, they're going to have. We don't have to fight each other, and that does make it. And so there are lots of cross-party groups. Obviously, the all-party parliamentary groups are cross-party, and they perform quite a substantial role as well in our discussion. And as Doreen Massey has said, it means that we can bring in outside organisations who are specialists in particular fields to advise us on that. And that helps our scrutiny as well.
Oh, thank you. Baroness Lane Fox, I can see you popped your hand up. If we come back to you and then perhaps to Lord Young, and then I think we'll have to move on to student questions at that point.
Don't worry, move on from me. I've made
was that accidental hand up? Easily done. Don't worry. So we'll come full circle and finish them with Lord Young.
I didn't actually have my hand up.
Was it a classic case of forgetting to put your hand out? Well, have you got anything you'd like to conclude?
Well, we could spend most of the time arguing about whether we should be appointed or elected. I happen to believe we should have a predominantly elected House, but only with a single term, for exactly the reason we've heard, that we wouldn't then have to fight an election and it would become less partisan than the House of Commons. However, the reality is that having tried to get the bill through in 2010 and failed, I think it's going to be some time before a government tries to reform the House of Lords when there are other more pressing pieces of legislation, and the prospects of getting it through both houses at the moment are fairly small. So I think we're going to have to stay with the present system for the time being.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you so much for that discussion, everybody. Those are really insightful points that I think our students will get a lot out of in their studies. So we've got some questions now that our students submitted in advance of this session. Now, interestingly, the first set of questions are about membership and pick up on quite a lot of the points that we've discussed. So perhaps Baroness Garden, if we can come to you for the first question. This is from St Edward's School in Poole, St Joan of Arc School in Rickmansworth, the Sixth Form College in Farnborough, and Cranford House School in Oxfordshire. So thank you all so much for submitting this question. And the question is, can you justify an unelected chamber scrutinising legislation that's proposed by elected representatives of the people? So Baroness Garden, perhaps you could provide your view on that for us.
Well, I think, as we've already touched on, I think it's very difficult to justify it, because we are a very old democracy, and yet half of our legislature is appointed at the whim of the Prime Minister of the day, and the current Prime Minister has had a lot of whims recently, and obviously some of them some of them are not at the moment looking like prime legislators, but who knows, you know, people can surprise once they get into the place, and people who you think will be really good take the title and you never see them again, and other people who you have doubts about really get stuck in and do the work. And so no, but the trouble is, you see, we've been there for so many hundreds of years. It's incredibly difficult in our lack of constitution actually to change things which we've done for hundreds of years. So as Lord Young has said, the prospects of our changing it, I think, are absolutely remote and virtually non-existent for the foreseeable future. But no, ideally, I would, like him, would like to see that we had far more democratic election in the Lords. I think it would make us much more respectable.
Thank you, Baroness Garden. Just because that's such a contentious issue, the unelected versus elected chamber, does anyone disagree with Baroness Garden on that point and think that the Lords works well as an unelected chamber? No. Okay, interesting.
Sorry,
right.
I think we do work well as an unelected chamber. I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't doubt that the value of what we do, but it's just the method by which we get there, which is so utterly dodgy.
All right, so Baroness Lane Fox, I'm going to come to you. Perhaps you can provide your point of view on that as well as this question, if that's all right. And the question's from Wallace High School up in Stirling, so thank you for this. And oh, no, it isn't. It's from Chownley High School for Boys in Luton. We're going to come back to you, Wallace High School. Watch this space, don't worry. So Baroness Lane Fox, this is linked to, I think, what you were saying about collaboration earlier. Do you think you find it easier than MPs in the House of Commons to not be constrained by the party line? And obviously, this is a pertinent question for you, given your position in the Lords.
Yes, thank you very much. So I was, just to go back to the elected versus unelected, you know, I 100% agree with my colleagues that we haven't got it quite right at the moment, but I also think it's not a disaster in terms of the House is doing its job. I personally think that I'm a people's peer. 2 peers are put into the crossbench group every year. I think that's still happening. You apply, you have an interview. So yes, I think the Prime Minister has to approve it, Baroness Gardner, but as I understand it, it's kind of separate. There's a separate appointments committee. Lord Lisfane would know the details more than me, perhaps. Anyway, I personally think that's an effective route. I think that having a purely elected chamber, you may lose some people who might not want to go through that. I don't know if there may be bits on the edge, but I think that we have routes into the Lords that are effective, and I would argue the one that I came in is a good one to double down on a bit. But to the question from, sorry, the boys' school in Luton. Hello,
so
boys.
Chownley High School. Hello, guys.
Very nice to meet you. Well, I'm a crossbench peer, as is Lord Lisfane, and we are therefore independent. We don't have any party political bias. We vote against the government, with the government sometimes. People have their own views and they are held closely to them. I don't think I could tell you actually very much of the political beliefs of very many of my crossbench colleagues. So we don't get whipped. You know, I'm an entrepreneur by background, and sometimes that can be quite hard. Sometimes you want to have a bit of advice and be told what to do. So I sometimes envy my colleagues with strong political parties behind them, because it's nice to be told, well, this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing. But actually, there's a real strength as well in having that independent voice. And quite often we can be the balance of decisions in the Lords, because there's a number of crossbenchers who will either, you know, support or not support amendments and move things forwards or backwards. So it's actually quite an interesting role to be in. But as I say, it's very different to our colleagues here who have a whip behind them, who are going to be terrified if they spot them, even in a virtual corridor, that they're going to get into trouble.
Oh, thank you very, very much. I can see Baroness Massey with your hand up. Would you like to come in very quickly on that before we move on to the next question? Because we've got lots to get through.
Yes, very, very quickly, to follow on what's been said about elected, non-elected. My concern is, one of my concerns is that I wonder if in elections we would be guaranteed to get a fair sprinkling of women, a fair sprinkling of disabled people, black and minority ethnic people. And I just think that, you know, it might, having had many people elected, not enough, women, BAME people in the last few years, and I see them come in and take their part superbly well. And I wonder how that could work unless we had a sort of weighted introduction system. But that does worry me. I think we've done quite well in the last few years.
I think that's a really good point, that diversity and inclusion has to be taken into account in these things. Thank you. So Lord Young, we're going to come to you next. So Wallace High School, it's your turn now, so don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. And that is, what are your thoughts on the remaining hereditary peers, and should they be allowed to remain in post?
The answer is we should all support an excellent private members bill introduced by Lord Grocott. And basically what he says is the by-elections for hereditary peers are something straight from Gilbert and Sullivan. And one of the by-elections, I think we had 4 candidates and 2 voters, which was an election for the Lib Dems. And one got through unanimously. Sue will have more details. And what Bruce Grocott wants to do is to allow the remaining hereditary peers to stay. And actually the remaining hereditary peers were elected, and they tend to turn up and do more heavy lifting actually than the appointed peers, because they want to be here. And then over a period of time, the hereditary peers would disappear, but they would remain in post. I don't know if Wallace High School asked the other half of their question, which is, are there too many peers? To which the answer is yes. We are trying to reduce our numbers, but as fast as we reduce our numbers, the Prime Minister keeps on topping them up. And so the incentive to make further inroads into our numbers is a little bit reduced, unless we can get the sort of assurance from the current Prime Minister that Theresa May gave, that she would exercise restraint when it comes to appointing peers. If that were to happen, then I think we could perhaps a few more conversations with people and suggest the time has come for them to stand down, and 2 out, 1 in.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that answers your question, Wallace High School. We're now going to move on to a few questions about House of Lords reform, and I'm going to come to Lord Lisvade first with a question from New College, Swindon. So thank you for this. And the question is, if there was a greater separation of powers between the legislature and the executive, would scrutiny of the executive be improved?
Well, I think that's a very arguable case. I think, though, that it would require huge constitutional change, because if you're talking about a real separation of powers, then you're taking ministers out of the House of Commons and out of the House of Lords. And the fact that ministers are in those 2 houses and have to be alive to the wishes and the business of those 2 houses, I think is a very good thing. But I would go back to what we were talking about earlier on, that there are ways of improving scrutiny of the government which would not involve separation of powers. And if we legislated better, for example, and if the government, and I've been banging this drum for a good many years, but if the civil service understood more about Parliament, then they'd be in a better position to advise ministers in a more constructive way about their relationship with Parliament, and I think that would only improve matters.
Thank you very, very much. So we're going to move on now to a question from St Mary's Academy in Blackpool and Port Glasgow High School, because they both agree that the UK Parliament could learn some lessons from the USA, which is interesting. So I'm going to throw this question out to whoever would like to answer it, and that is, do you think establishing something similar to the USA Senate would be a more effective and representative way to hold the government to account? Obviously, American politics very much in the limelight at the moment. So would anyone like to come in and answer that? I can see, Baroness Massey, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, I'm not an expert on American politics, but I do have children living there, and it's election time at the moment, so it's all very exciting, a bit too exciting sometimes. I think that what we have to grasp is that American politics is very differently organised to ours. And I would urge people to not forget the powers of the Supreme Court in American politics. We've just had an election. Donald Trump has just promoted a woman to the Supreme Court who is extremely right-wing, and it's happened before, and that tips the balance. Before it was a Democrat, that tips the balance, and it's easy to get caught into what the Supreme Court can do and can't do. Also, the power of the president is extraordinary in the United States. So I think that with the elections of the Senate are, of course, different also. They roll over every 2 years. They change by 1/3 every 2 years. So I wouldn't like to see that, actually. No, I think that you need more to get more settled in that before you can actually make a real difference.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Baroness Massey. And thank you as well to Arnold Lodge School in Leamington Spa, Arthur Terry School in Sutton Coldfield, Fife College and Stourport High School for your question on House of Lords reform. I think we've covered that in quite a lot of detail. So I think we'll move on to some questions now on diversity and inclusion. So I know you've just finished speaking, Baroness Massey, but as this is rather a specialist subject of you, I'm going to come back to you for a quick question, if that's all right. And that is, in what ways do you take equality, so gender, sexual orientation and race, etc., into consideration when scrutinising the work of the government?
I would start with the point that you can't do that unless you've actually got people who are from black and minority backgrounds, people who are women, sexuality, different sexualities. So I think, as I said earlier, we now have more people who are women, BAME and disabled and so on than we had certainly when I went into the House of Lords. I think that the issue about diversity is incredibly important. And again, in select committees, we discuss quite a bit about gender and sexuality and ethnicity. In fact, we've just commented very significantly on issues to do with the Black Lives Matter. And we've had it, of course, we don't do that on our own. As I said earlier on, we consult outside. And what I'm pleased at about the House of Lords, well, the Commons too do it, that we haven't got children in the House of Lords, for example. And I'm a great supporter of children's rights. But what we can do is get a voluntary sector organisation in who has a children's panel, and they can bring the children with them to talk about a particular issue. And I think that's brilliant. And for the Black Lives Matter, we called in a research company who is made up entirely Black and Asian researchers and consultants to ask us to ask them what we should be looking at in particular. And one of the things that came up very forcibly was, well, black women in maternity units and what happens to them and babies. So I think we do try to include people who are experts themselves, not just ourselves.
Thank you very much for that, Baroness Massey. Baroness Lane Fox, I can see you've got your hand up, so perhaps I can ask you the next question on diversity and inclusion. You can make your point on that. So this is from Fitzallen High School in Cardiff. I do hope I've said that right. Thank you for joining us. And they've said that we are a school with an 85% BAME population from one of the most deprived areas of Wales. How does the House of Lords effectively represent our community and enable us to achieve beyond our current communities?
That's an incredibly important question. Lovely not to see you, but to sort of see you here today, guys. I would really echo what Baroness Massey has said. This is so fundamental to making sure that the House of Lords is credible and has validity and does its job effectively, as making sure it feels as diverse as possible. And even when it maybe hasn't got exactly, I would love there to be more women. I would love there to be more people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnicities and so on. But being able to bring those voices in where appropriate is also incredibly important. And I think that the House of Lords is pretty effective at that. Again, to go back to our select committee on COVID, we launched our work by doing a huge exercise to ask people what they thought the long-term implications were for the UK, to try and get out there and really talk to different communities. And one of the good things about this virtual setting is that we could set up lots of kind of drop-in groups for our members of the committee to talk to people from very, very different backgrounds. We had people talking from the Roma community. We had people talking with extreme learning difficulties. We had people coming from, refugees, asylum seekers and so on. So you can construct it so that those voices get into the room, and it's immensely important to do so. So I think that it's very much in the minds of many members of the Lords. And if you go back to something, sorry, I can't remember if it was Baroness Massey or Lord Young had said at the beginning, but the tax credits, amendments, they were really putting the needs of the most vulnerable at the heart of how the Lords was thinking about that legislation. And very often people are standing up and representing the voices, even if they don't come from those communities themselves, I think because of connections through their own charitable work or outside organisations. So my perspective is actually people are put at the heart of the Lords, who maybe don't look and feel quite like all of us, but there is still more to do. And I would say it is incredibly important that the Lords keeps its eyes on the outside world and the experience, the real experience, lived experience of people in this country, because we don't have constituents we're talking to every week, but we do have this incredible network of organisations through the people that are in the chamber. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you Fitzalan High School for that fantastic question. So in the last 5 minutes, we're going to focus on the evolution of the House of Lords and have some questions about scrutiny generally as well. So we have a very popular question from Coleg Cambria in Wrexham, Malmesbury College, Uplands Community College in Wadhurst, and Lord Williams School. And their question is it fair to say that recent Brexit and COVID legislation has shown a weakness in parliamentary scrutiny? So I think, who have we not heard from for a while? Shall we start with Lord Lisvane for that question, and then maybe move on to Baroness Garden, who we've not heard from for a while?
I can give a very quick answer to that. Yes. And,
thank you very much.
One of the reasons, of course, is that a lot of this has had to be done at great speed. And shall we say, the development of government policy has not always been smooth or predictable. So that is a factor. But the other thing is that a great deal has been done by secondary legislation and using the Health Act 1984, not the Civil Contingencies Act, which would have provided a greater level of parliamentary scrutiny. And the other thing, I think, which has been unfortunate from a public point of view, is that a great deal of what the government has been saying has been, as it were, instructions which don't actually have the force of law. And there, I think there are some really important rule of law implications, as well as those of parliamentary scrutiny.
Thank you very much. I think we can possibly link this to another question from Highgate Wood School in London. And they ask how effective Parliament can be in holding the government to account when the governing party holds such a large majority in the House of Commons. So I wonder whether, Baroness Garden, would you like to come in on that point? Oh, Lord Young, I can see you've got your hand up. We'll come to you next. So Baroness Garden.
No, I think this obviously is a problem at the moment because however hard the Lords fights and however much reason they put into their amendments, the majority in the Commons means they can always be overturned. And we have this thing called ping pong at the end of a bill, where if the Lords' amendment is just disagreed in the Commons, it comes back to the Lords saying, Lords, do you want to change your minds? And the tradition has been that we only allow ping pong to go, say, a couple of times before we say, right, Commons, you're elected, we're not, you have your way. But I think the issues, both on Brexit and on COVID, are now so fundamentally important that we are likely to be having more of a battle with the Commons to try and make them change their minds on things we think are really important, like the recent piece of legislation on legislation to overturn international law. And I think things like that are things that the Lords just might stick its little toes in about. But I absolutely agree with what Lord Lisvane said on this. It is a problem that things are moving very quickly, and the government has a tendency to go to the media before it comes to us. And I think that is a very, very bad practice.
Thank you very much. So Lord Young, we're going to come to you next, but I think there might be a link here with another question submitted by Sir John Leman High School in Suffolk and Loretto School in East Lothian in Scotland, because they want to know how far the Salisbury Convention limits the scrutiny of the House of Lords and whether that should ever be broken. And obviously at the moment we're in extraordinary times. I wonder whether you could provide an answer to that as well as any other comments you'd like to make.
The Salisbury Convention, I think, was introduced after the Second World War, and I think I'm right in saying the Liberals never actually subscribed to it. But basically it said the House of Lords should not overturn a commitment made by the governing party if it was in its manifesto. That I'm sure Lord Lisvane will correct me if I haven't got it absolutely right, but that was basically that the unelected chamber should not overturn the mandate of the elected chamber. And by and large, that has been observed ever since. And I think the House of Lords would think long and hard before it took on the House of Commons when it had a clear electoral mandate for whatever it was doing. And the House of Lords is actually quite good at not overreaching itself when it comes to exercising its powers. Just a footnote on the previous question, having been Chief Whip in the House of Commons, I was interested in the proposition that if you've got a majority in the House of Commons, everything's all right. The House of Commons has become progressively more rebellious over the last few years. And the Chief Whip can no longer rely on the unswerving loyalty of his party members. Quite often, it won't come to a defeat in the Commons because it'll be made absolutely clear by the whips to the government that there's no point in introducing this legislation or this amendment, Prime Minister, because I'm sorry, I can't get the troops into the lobby. So there are constraints, even with a large majority in the House of Commons, but they're not always quite as visible as a rebellion on the floor of the chamber.
Thank you very much for that, Lord Young. We have actually reached 11:45. So as Lord Lisvane very conveniently has his hand up, I wonder if you'd like to just conclude things for us for today, and then we'll have to finish. But thank you so much for such a fantastic discussion and for answering those questions so brilliantly.
Well, I hope I don't spoil it all now. But just to pick up on what Sue Garden was saying, a couple of rounds of ping pong. Occasionally, there have been many more. Corporate manslaughter and corporate homicide a few years ago, we had 7 rounds of ping pong. And just to pick up also on the Salisbury Convention so elegantly described by Lord Young, it is many things to many people. And it was born out of an extraordinary political imbalance in the House of Lords in 1945. So it's 75 years old. And really, at its basis, what it means is that the House of Lords should not actually reject on second or third reading, or simply put a bill away in a cupboard that has been approved by the party which has won a general election. But of course, there are many, many actions short of that in terms of asking the Commons to think again, putting alternative propositions, which don't result in a bill being rejected, but might result in much better legislation.
Thank you very much. Fantastic concluding remarks there. I just want to also say a very special thank you to Ridgewood School in Doncaster, King's School, Oxford, and St Mary's Catholic Academy, Blackpool, and Kingsley School. I'm so sorry we didn't get around to your questions today, but I do hope that our peers picked up on some of the things that you wanted to know during that discussion. So I just want to say an enormous thank you to our panelists for joining us today for our first ever online attempt at this session. I think it went rather well in the circumstances, so thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of you that are watching all over the UK. I do hope that will come in useful for your studies, and just good luck and thank you so much for joining us. I know some of you are joining us on Friday for our second Learn with the Lords question time, so we look forward to seeing you then. But until then, thank you so much and goodbye.